In this video, as promised, it's the studio sessions from the Foxgloves that you might have seen me painting in the last video when I was talking a lot more about the history and the folklore and the fascinating science surrounding the foxglove. But I hope you'll enjoy seeing these paintings come to life, and there are going to be lots of tips about how to use media that you've already got in a fun, creative way to produce your own artwork. I'm going to take you through the steps to make a mixed media painting of a flower. In this case, it's of a foxglove, but you could use this and apply it to any flower you want, any other plant. I'm going to show you two paintings I made, and then there'll be another video where I'm going to show how I made some prints using the plant material itself, so both the leaves and the flowers. So look out for that one. These aren't detailed botanical illustrations. Rather, I wanted to sort of try and capture the beauty and some of the personality of the flower. And I wanted to keep it really kind of loose, so both the sketching and the paintwork is quite sort of lively. And I will list all the supplies I'm using below. But, and this is a really important point, it doesn't really matter what you use because it's mixed media. I'm sure if you're anything like me, you might not have quite as much as me, but you've got quite a few art materials. There might even be some that you've bought and you've never used, or somebody's given them to you. Now is the time to break them out and just have a play with them, because all artwork really is playing and creating. And I also think that, don't spend any extra money. Maybe you might need some particular paper if there's something you really haven't got, but try as much as possible to use any materials you already have. And also, it can be really fun to sort of put things together that you might not normally. You might keep your pencil, you might do pencil drawings, you might do paintwork, you might do something with pastels, but have you thought about using them all together? That's kind of the point of this video. I'm using a basic watercolour paper, quite a cheap one. I'll put the weight below, as I can't quite think of it. It's quite a thick one because that's quite important. If you're doing sort of lots of mixed media, different techniques and washes and maybe rubbing the paper, you do need quite a robust paper that can stand up to that kind of treatment. I've got the foxglove in front of me because they're out at the moment. But if you don't have the particular plant in your garden or somewhere close to you, you could, of course, work from a photograph, and I often do that during the winter months. And in the first version, I'm going to sketch out a rough outline using a soft pencil. I think it was either 2B or a 4B. While I'm not worrying about getting every detail accurately, I am trying to make it look like a foxglove. So if there's any bit that I'm not happy with, I will just use my eraser. I'm trying not to, I think I just used it once or twice. I don't want to get too precious about it and too precise, because I think that sort of makes you tighten up, and then your overall work won't be as full of life as you might like it to be. And a very distinctive feature of foxgloves is that they flower from the bottom, and I talk about that in the other video. It's quite interesting, the reason behind that and the science. So I want to really sort of show that there's this sort of graduation. So you've got the full flowers at the bottom. Sometimes they're a little bit going over while there's still buds at the top. Before I start the actual painting, I'm going to use some masking fluid. If you've never used this, it's a sort of latex product, a bit like the old copy decks. Can you still get that? Let me know if you can still get that. I haven't seen it around for years, but it's that sort of rubberized glue that you could sort of rub off quite satisfyingly between your fingers. Well, this is just like that. You use it to mask any area that you want to keep pale. You want to keep the colour of the paper, so you can then do washes and anything else on top, and then when that's all dry you can rub it off and fill in any details. So I'm using it here because I don't know if you've ever looked at the dots that are inside the flowers, the bells of the foxglove, but they have these very noticeable spots. And again, I talk about that in the other video. But each one, although they're dark, it sort of has a pale halo around it. Here's a close-up of one so you can see what I mean. And I thought the best way of doing this was to use the masking fluid. So I'm using this with this flexible tool that sort of has a quite sort of malleable point, but it does make quite a point. So that's quite good for dotting the fluid on. You don't need this. You could use something like a knitting needle or even a blunt pencil or just sort of anything that you can sort of poke with if that's the effect you want. You can also use the masking fluid to cover sort of lines, anything that you want to keep pale, and then perhaps work on at the end, or just to keep the white of the paper. So I'm making sure to wait till the masking fluid is dry, and then we can start adding the colour, and it doesn't take very long to dry. For this I'm using my watercolours. I do mostly use artist quality. Watercolours tend to come in artist quality and student quality, and I would really urge to use the artist quality because they're more concentrated, you get a better pigment, and they last longer. So it'd be better to get just a few of the more expensive ones rather than a big set of the cheaper ones, and you only need a few colours to be able to mix. You need the 3 primary colours, so yellow, blue and red, and you need them in both warm tones and cool tones. And if you've got those 6 colours, you can pretty much make anything. I mean, I have added a few of my favourite ones just to sort of extend the range. And also for this project, I more recently got this other set, which is pastels, because it's a little bit difficult to make those colours with watercolour without adding a lot of white, which is something you can do. Another tip is that if you use gouache or you just have some of those, which are another water-based paint, but they're a bit more concentrated than the watercolours and they have more body to them. If you just have a white one of those and add that to a little bit of the watercolour, because they mix and match, as I say, they're both water-based, you can make pastel colours quite easily. Whatever you have or a basic set will be absolutely fine. And if you're learning watercolour painting, I don't know, on a course or something, or formally, there are quite a lot of rules, and I don't work like that. I mean, I have done that in the past, but I just like to use it a bit more expressively. So one of the rules is that you always work from the pale colours to the dark colours, which does make sense, but sometimes it depends what you're painting. And so for this, I decided to do the foliage first because I wanted to get the structure of that. So I'm just mixing the blues and the yellows to get the shade of green I want. That can often take a while because there's so many different shades of green. I wanted to get this slightly sort of greyish green, because that's kind of what you see in foxgloves, and also I kind of go towards that shade. So even if it wasn't exactly like that in the wild, I would probably make it like that because it's more aesthetically pleasing to me, and I'm mostly doing this painting to please myself, and I think you should do that when you're approaching anything. So don't get too hung up on getting details and colours exactly right. It's what's important to you that matters. So I've done the foliage, and now I'm using a combination of pinks and purples to fill in the flowers, and I think I added a little bit of green to the openings of the flower mouths because there was this sort of green tinge to it. And again, as with the sketching, I'm trying to keep this as loose as possible. And one tip for this is that if you hold your brush, try and keep your sort of shoulders relaxed. Don't hold the brush or the pencil too close to the business area, but hold it further down, and you'll find you'll get more expressive strokes like that. And you can also see that I'm not too bothered if I go over the lines. I then wait for this layer to dry, which in the summer happens very quickly. It can be a problem when things dry too quickly, but with watercolours you're fine. And I want to add a bit more definition. So for this, I'm going to use one of my favourite things to use in any form of art, which is the Derwent Inktense pencils. I think there's some other makes that do it. And they're kind of like almost like solid watercolour, but in stick form. So you can use them like regular pencils, but if you add water, they become sort of washy like the watercolours. And you can also use them on fabric, in which case I would probably use them with a textile medium, and that will then again make them flow, but also it will fix them onto the fabric. And yeah, there are lots of different ways you can use them. You can, so you can draw with them first, then add the liquid, or you can add the liquid as you go. And I sometimes just use them as regular pencils because I'm lucky to have this big box. So I've got a lovely selection of lots of different shades, which is great. And for this here, I'm going to use them more like regular colouring pencils, but I'm not going to worry if they do get wet if I do extra layers. Just to point out that the colour does get more intense as soon as you add a liquid to it, and then that intensity remains. They get more saturated. So that's something to bear in mind if you're trying to match something exactly. I'm also using some Neocolor sticks, which are quite similar. Again, they're water soluble, but they come in more sort of crayon-like form. And I also have, you can see on the left of the desk that I've got some Inktense blocks, which again are a similar thing. They come in a sort of square shape, so you've got an edge, and the edge you can get more finer lines, but they're really good if you want to fill a big area. You can just use it on its side, and then you get these sort of big expressive marks. And then once everything is dry, and I've got enough detail in, I'm going to rub off the masking fluid. And as I say, it's a bit like the old copy decks. It sort of gets very rubbery, and it's quite a sort of enjoyable thing to do. And then the last thing I do is to use a pencil just to fill in the sort of blacky purple dots inside the flower mouths, and then this piece is finished. With this second piece, I decided to go freestyle and not use any pencil outline. Now, when you're doing this, it's really not until the end that it all comes together. So if you're going to have a go at this, just trust the process and don't worry if at the beginning or halfway through you're not sure how it's looking, because I promise you it will look better by the end. I'm using the same watercolour paper as before, but this time I'm using a larger brush. So for two reasons really. It carries more of the paint in it, so you can cover bigger areas, and it means you can do bigger strokes. And then once I've filled in the kind of first layer of the flowers, I'm using the Neocolor sticks again to add some more definition. And then I add some white oil pastel. Now you might wonder why I'm adding something that you can't really see. Well, the beauty of using something that's oil based is that obviously oil and water don't mix. So what will happen if I then put a wash over it, it's going to repel, and you're going to see that probably the sort of texture of the paper coming through. So that's a really fun thing to play around with if you've got any oil-based media to use. And then I'm going to add a few lines with the Inktense pencil, which will blur when the water is added. And I put some milky sort of coloured paint on the flower openings. And while this is still wet, I'm sprinkling some rock salt onto it. What this does, it will gradually dissolve, and as it does, it repels the pigment around it and sort of concentrates it underneath. So you can get these sort of beautiful starburst effects, which I think will sort of mimic the look of the spotty flowers. It's a bit difficult to see this on camera, so I'm going to show you a sample now that I'm doing with a darker colour so you can see the effect better. And also you can experiment with different grades of salt. So if you use salt from a salt cell, it's obviously going to be much finer, so you might get a sort of beautiful speckled effect. So it just depends kind of the effect that you're looking for. And then to make this really mixed media, I'm adding in some acrylic inks. These come in all sorts of colours, lots of different makes, and they're very concentrated, so you get a real sort of intensity of colour. And I'm putting some of this dark pink onto an old toothbrush. I collect old toothbrushes when they, get too old to use for their proper purpose. And you can spatter with them. So you just need to sort of soak the head in a little bit of paint or ink, and then use something to scrape across the top of the surface of the brush, and that will spatter the paint or ink. And you do have to be careful with this because it does go everywhere, so make sure you've got other paper or plastic around the piece that you're working on. And then I'm also using the ink directly from the bottle with the pipette that comes with it. And I like how this gives a different sort of stroke, a different sort of mark, but it's kind of quite strong and intense. And I'm using it mostly on one side of each flower to give it some dimension. So obviously where it's dark, it's going to recede, and where you've got lighter colours, it's going to come forward. And after that, I add a little bit of the purple watercolour to it, just to modify the colour a little bit. And again, because these are both water-based, they mix beautifully. And then I also just use I've got some regular wax crayons that I like to use as well, just again to add a slightly different texture. And when this part of the painting is dry, I'm going to use my big brush again and add the stems and all the parts that will eventually become seed heads, because they're the areas where the flowers have fallen off. And I think they're a very distinctive part of a foxglove. So I really want to make sure I capture those. And I'm actually using the brush to make these shapes. So if I use it on the side, then it's going to be quite fat and you're going to get the sort of fullness of the round shape. But then I can use the tip and sort of pull the paint out a little bit and get these lovely pointy bits. So here's the piece finished, and I hope you agree that it did come together in the end. As I say, it's not supposed to be a botanical illustration, but I think anybody who knows their plants, who looks at it, would know it was a foxglove. And obviously you can use these types of techniques on any flower and any plant. So if you have a favourite flower that you've always admired and would like to paint but have been a little bit hesitant, I hope I've given you some ideas to use to make it fun and creative. And do let me know in the comments if there's a particular flower that you're intending on painting. I'd love to know. And look out for the next video where I'm going to show how I do the printing with the actual plant material itself. And I'll also link the playlist here because I'm trying to work through the year with plants and flowers from my garden. And at the end of it, I'm going to put them all together in some sort of book. I haven't decided exactly what I'm going to do. So do have a look at that as well. And I'll see you again soon back in the studio.